recorded in live time, and there'll be opportunity to view this at a later point as well. Let me introduce who I am. My name is Brian Anderson. I'm your moderator tonight, kind of working us through the agenda, which I will get to shortly. But I do want to do a brief biography of myself so folks kind of know how I landed to this event. I am a licensed professional counselor and a certified substance abuse counselor for the state of Virginia. I'm the proud alumni of two historically Black college universities, one being the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, where I have a Bachelor of Arts degree. I also have a Master of Arts in Mental Health Counseling through Bowie State University. I'm a long tenured Fairfax County government employee of 20 years. 16 of those years have been with the Fairfax Falls Church Community Service Board. I've held supervisory leadership positions in various programs to include residential programming, jail-based behavioral health services that are embedded within Fairfax County's Adult Detention Center. I've also been a supervisor and interim program manager of a youth adolescent day treatment program that had school and a mental health component attached as well. My current position with the Fairfax Falls Church CSB is a program manager of a behavioral health outpatient site that's located at the Northwest Center, which is in Reston, Virginia. We serve folks with case management needs and therapeutic services. Majority of our clients have a severe mental illness and a substance use disorder. Additionally, and lastly, in terms of introducing myself, I'm the co-equity lead for the Falls Church Community Service Board with One Fairfax, which intentionally considers equity when making policies, planning, and delivering programs and services within local county government. And at this point, we can move to the next slide. All right, so I gave you a welcoming. You already heard from me. We'll keep going. And you heard from me as the moderator as well. So now let's talk about the agenda and how we have the structure set up tonight. We just went through the welcoming. Some housekeeping issues and what's relevant for folks to kind of know what their needs are in terms of if you get stuck. Please make sure your audio is where it needs to be. It's very relevant to make sure you get the information. There's different things you can do with checking your audio tab if you get lost. And if things get really, really bad, we have a wonderful producer, Giovanni Bland, who you could connect with through chat to kind of help you through any challenges you may be experiencing. Okay, we can keep going through the next slide. All right, so we covered housekeeping issues. We'll keep following through. All right, so it's very important to talk about the history of how we kind of came together. Multiple agencies were formulated in late February and early March. So for the last 3.5 months, we've met routinely, consistently on Fridays. We did take a break because there was a pandemic that everybody's well aware of at this point. So it kind of stopped action from mid-March to early May. But different organizations made this possible. Those different organizations, so folks know who's had involvement, include NCS, which is Neighborhood Community Services, DFS, Department of Family Services, the Health Department, FCPS, Fairfax County Public Schools has representation within our work group, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, and as I previously mentioned, the Fairfax Falls Church Community Service Board. And overall, the goal was being, where can folks, and this is how we kind of came to the title, where can folks in the African-American community really find a safe space to talk about significant issues that in fact impact the community, specifically related to trauma, specifically issues around racism, oppression, mass incarceration and poverty, just to name a few. So all these different areas is what we're going to intentionally talk about tonight to offer support, but we are inclusive, so everybody's welcome. But we really try to maximize the opportunity to give the African-American community a safe space to really work through these deep-rooted issues. All right, we'll keep going. And as you see, all the different partners have their logo reference, just to kind of highlight and magnify what I was referencing earlier in terms of the collaborative agencies that kind of made this event possible tonight. Next slide, please. All right. So before we get to introduction, I did want to reference an opportunity. This will be post-event. There'll be one survey that will come through email. that folks will see, because we would like to do this event all over again. So I just wanted to make mention of that. And there's also some resources that you'll get towards the end of the night as well. And it's actually in the handout section, but I would strongly encourage, before looking at the handouts, just be present, be available for this process that we're having right now. So now let me introduce one of our panelists who will be involved in our panel discussion later tonight. Dr. Otis Williams. Let's go into his biography. Dr. Otis Williams III is a PhD and a chair associate professor in the Department of Counseling at Bowie State University currently. He received a PhD in counseling psychology with a subspecialty in African studies from Howard University. Dr. Williams has worked in many clinical settings, including correctional facilities, juvenile services, group homes, home-based and urban schools. His research interests include racism-related stress and trauma, traditional African spirituality and counseling, and Black male-female relationships. He is also an ad hoc reviewer for the Journal of Black Psychology and the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation. Dr. Williams is the recipient of several local and national awards, including the Association of Black Psychologists in 2016, the Dr. Bobby E. Wright Award, and their Eastern Region Warrior Healer Award. Let's please give, because we're in virtual times, a silent clap and a silent round of applause for Dr. Otis Williams.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to transition to talk about our second panelist, who's going to take the floor very, very shortly when she gives her presentation, which I will explain in a couple moments. And she'll, of course, take the floor. So here is the biography of Dr. Randall Dent. Dr. Randall Dent is currently an equity scholar at the Fitzhugh Mullen Institute for Health Workforce at George Washington University, which is located in Washington, D.C. She recently graduated with her PhD in health psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University, better known as VCU for most folks. While in Richmond, Randall completed a National Science Foundation funded behavioral health equity research internship at the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. Most of us, and quite a bit of us who have heard from Dr. Randall Dent, has probably heard previous presentations she's given on Black mental health at the Virginia Behavioral Health Equity Summit that just happened last February in Roanoke, which was sponsored by DBHTS and other forums across Virginia. Let's do the same like we did Dr. Williams, and let's give Dr. Randall Dent a warm welcoming and a round of applause silently as she gives her presentation on mental health in the Black communities, shifting the narrative. So if we can get the slides to move over for the presentation. Okay, over to you, Dr. Randall Dent.
You can go to the next slide. Thank you, Brian, for the warm welcome, and good evening, everyone. As Brian stated, my name is Randall Dent, and I'm really grateful to be able to talk with you all today about mental health stigma in Black communities. Next slide, please. So I want to be clear that this presentation is meant to be a brief introduction to mental health stigma in Black communities. So I will touch briefly on the following questions. The first question will be, what is mental health stigma, so that we can all have the same shared definition of what we'll be talking about today. Next question is, what can mental health stigma look like in Black communities? I also am going to talk about the origins of mental health stigma. And then I will transition into talking about how stigma may impact our ability to get needed mental health care. I will then transition into talking about how we can combat stigma in our communities, and I will end with an affirmation. Next slide, please. So when we say mental health stigma, what exactly do we mean? Typically, we're talking about negative reactions and thoughts people may experience after revealing that they had some sort of psychological distress or have a mental illness or may have sought help for their mental health. When we say mental health stigma in this way, typically we're referring to public stigma. And so that's how others react to you sharing about your mental health and your mental health journey. But there's also another form of stigma that impacts us greatly, and that's private stigma. Private stigma is rooted in how people view themselves after experiencing mental health issues or seeking treatment for their mental health issues. Most times, private stigma seems to be public stigma just internalized. For example, with public stigma, others may say that people that are experiencing mental health issues are weak. Private stigma is when the person who is experiencing a mental health issue says to themselves, I am weak. And so I always think it's important to start with definitions just so that we have a shared understanding of where we are going forward. So now that we have defined mental health stigma, we can now move on to what can mental health stigma look like in Black communities. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I want to share a few phrases that I've heard, not only in my work, but with my family and with my friends. And many of you have probably heard the same things in conversation with your friends and family. We don't suffer from mental illness. I'm strong enough to handle it on my own. Our ancestors have been through so much worse. It's a private matter. Keep it in the family. And lastly, if I go to therapy, I don't have enough faith. So let me know in the questions tab. You can comment and tell me if you've heard some of these things before in conversations with your friends and your family. But before I move on to how we can combat stigma, I want to talk about the origins of mental health stigma in Black communities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go into a brief history lesson, and I want you guys to stay with me. It's really important for us to understand our history so that we can understand our present. And so when we're talking about stigma in Black communities, we have to take a historical view to better understand our present. And so in the 1700s to about the mid 1800s, white doctors came up with this idea called the immunity hypothesis. The immunity hypothesis stated that enslaved Africans could not experience mental illness because they did not have the stresses of profit making. Essentially, this means that in the eyes of white doctors, because enslaved Africans were not able to own property or to vote or to do anything that was of value to society, they could not possibly experience mental illness. But in the decades before the Civil War, there seemed to be a shift. And so there was this new idea that emerged called the exaggerated risk hypothesis. And so what the exaggerated risk hypothesis states is that in the 1840 census, that free Black people actually experienced higher rates of mental illness. This is in direct contradiction to the immunity hypothesis I just stated. White physicians went as far to make up diseases such as drapetomania, which is the disease causing enslaved Africans to run away, and dysesthesia ethiopica, which is a disease affecting both the mind and body and causing lethargy and lesions. These diseases were made up to make the broader American public believe that Black people would not be able to handle their freedom. Next slide, please. So when we talk about mental health and stigma in Black communities, we have to talk about the fact that medical and mental health diagnoses have been weaponized against Black people and have been used to pathologize a human instinct for freedom and for dignity. And they use this to uphold slavery as necessary and even beneficial to Black Americans. Given the abuses that we Black people have suffered at the hands of the mental and medical healthcare systems, Black people have a warranted mistrust of both of those systems. Many of us have heard about the Tuskegee study that went on for 40 years when Black men were enrolled in a study to examine the effects of untreated syphilis. Syphilis, for those who don't know, is a sexually transmitted disease. And when penicillin became the recommended treatment for syphilis in 1947, about 15 years into the study, the medicine was withheld from the Black men that were enrolled in the study. And some of us have also heard about Henrietta Lacks, whom HeLa cells are named after. She was a Black woman who was receiving treatment for cervical cancer and had her cells harvested from her without her consent. And the HeLa cells have been, to date, the only cells that were able to reproduce indefinitely and have contributed to many medical breakthroughs, from cures for polio to developing treatment for leukemia and other forms of cancer. And lastly, something that most of us may not know about is that early mental health institutions that were known as asylums also perpetrated harms against Black Americans. And an example of this is the fact that in the history of Central State, there was a time where patients were actually loaned out to white affluent communities that were nearby to cook, to clean. And in many ways, these early mental health institutions were meant to be an extension of slavery. So when we talk about mental health stigma in Black communities, we have to discuss the origin. Stigma around mental health in Black communities grew because of the warranted mistrust in the things that we experienced within the medical and mental health care systems. Next slide, please. And so now I want to go back to those quotes and phrases that I mentioned a couple slides ago. And I want to put them in the context of our history. So for example, we don't suffer from mental illness. I argue that this idea extends from the immunity hypothesis of the 18th century. It's a private matter, we should keep it in the family. I think that stemmed from the fact that, as I just stated, Black people have suffered at the hands of the medical and mental health care systems. And within the mental health care system, Black people have been misdiagnosed and overdiagnosed with disorders like schizophrenia. So as we always do, Black communities wanted to protect their own from the abuse that was occurring within those systems. And it was always meant to be protective. But I think it's possible that in trying to protect ourselves, we may have gone too far into not even talking about mental health within our families. So what was meant to be protective may not be so anymore. And lastly, for this slide, is the phrase, our ancestors have been through so much worse. And I'm not going to disagree with that. It's absolutely true. But that does not mean that the trauma that we experience from present day racism, police brutality, and oppression, that we shouldn't seek help for any mental health issues that may come up as a result of that. I would also argue that we have to understand that in our bodies, we are still experiencing trauma that has been passed from generation to generation since our ancestors arrived in this country. So we also need to address that. You can move on to the next slide. The last two quotes I want to mention are, I'm strong enough to handle it on my own. We are a strong and resilient people. We know this, and it's evidenced by the fact that we have survived. But I really love this quote that I found on the Therapy for Black Men website. And it says, strength still needs support. Just because we can do it on our own doesn't mean that we have to. And I like to think about how much stronger we would be if we only were able to get the support that we need. The last quote I will share with you all is, if I go to therapy, I don't have enough faith. And you see the picture on the slide says, it's okay to have Jesus and a therapist too. I was recently watching an interview with Bishop T.D. Jakes where he said, I don't believe that you can always use a spiritual antidote to a mental or emotional problem. I think you have to treat what is hurting with what is necessary to get better. And so just like we would go to the doctor for a broken leg, we wouldn't try to fix that ourselves. We should also go and seek treatment when we're experiencing mental health issues. And research has shown that when the religious leaders that we trust and admire encourage us to seek help for our mental health, we are much more likely to get the help we need. Next slide, please. So how does stigma impact our ability to get needed mental health care? When we as Black people have concerns about mental health stigma and how we may be perceived, we delay or avoid treatment for mental health issues. In a lot of ways, we feel that we have to choose between our social health and our mental health. If we talk about our mental health, if we go to therapy, what will people that we love and care about think about us? And so mental health stigma really may prevent us from getting the help that we need. I really love the picture that's on the slide because it's a really good representation of what happens when stigma keeps us from talking about our mental health issues or seeking help. We end up carrying those things and our mental health issues around with us, and they start to negatively impact different parts of our lives. And so you can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So to the question, why should we combat mental health stigma in our communities? I have a simple answer. We as Black people deserve to live healthy, full lives in which we are safe, valued, and affirmed. And so we have to really accept that taking care of ourselves and our mental health is an essential part of our overall health and living a healthy, full life. Next slide, please. So in our communities, how can we shift the narrative about mental health? I know that so many of us are already doing the work on the ground of combating the stigma of mental illness in Black communities, but here are some of the things that I do. I work a lot with college students. They're my favorite. And one of the things that I do is try to dispel myths about mental health and therapy and what it might be like, and kind of really help with their anxieties that they may have about seeking services for the first time. Another way that we can shift the narrative about mental health is to normalize talking about your mental health and seeking help with your loved ones. I recently found out that a relative whom I love and really deeply admire sought mental health care services probably 30 years ago, and it was really, really helpful for her. And I imagine that if I had known that when I was going through my own struggles, I would have not have been as resistant as maybe I was to seeking services. And lastly, it's important to talk about going to therapy or going to group therapy or just talking about your mental health and wellness and what you're doing to protect it, like you would going to a physical wellness visit. Just like if you're going to your primary care physician for that annual free checkup, if you have insurance, that you would talk about that in the same way that you talk about your therapy appointments. You can go ahead to the next slide. So it is important to note that while we Black people work on talking about mental health in our communities, the mental health care systems have to do their part too. So the mental health care systems and the people that work within them should be constantly working towards making sure that they are building trust with Black communities. Because as I talked about in the history portion, there's a lot to overcome. They should be offering community-based treatment options, and they should be incorporating models of care that center our experiences as Black people in this country. Black people deserve access to quality, appropriate, and culturally responsive mental health care. And creating a pipeline of training Black mental health professionals and hiring them into the field and into leadership positions is a crucial part of making sure that Black people can get quality, appropriate, and culturally responsive mental health care. And if this is possible, then increasing the number of Black mental health professionals will allow us to seek care from people who understand us and look like us. You can move on to the next slide. So before I finish up, I hope that you will say this ending affirmation with me from the comfort of your home. As a Black person, I deserve to live a healthy, full life in which I am safe, valued, and affirmed. I know that times are tough for many of us, given what's going on in the world, and I hope that you will say that to yourself and believe those words as we continue, well, as you continue through this year and as we continue through our conversation. Yeah, next slide. Thank you all for engaging with me this evening, and I should have time for 2 or 3 questions from the question tab, if that's okay with Brian and Giovanni.
I'm giving you the thumbs up, Randall. We do have 5 minutes to stay on track. There's a lot of information, but we do want, if folks have a question, we can briefly look at the chat feature and do a fast Q&A for the next 5 minutes. But before that, as people are typing, I do want to recognize a technical issue that's been brought to my attention. For folks that would normally go through closed caption, there's a way you can use the hyperlink to go through the browser to get the information. And we're going to send out slides. So fear yet, we will make sure everybody gets the information. But I did want to recognize folks that are trying to get the information are not, some folks aren't able to do so. So I felt the need to kind of mention that now. So folks, I'm actually getting information now and looking through the chat. So just hang in there because Dr. Dent's about to answer some questions. So one of the questions is, what role does the church play in regards to mental health? Can you take that first one, Dr. Dent?
That's a great question. I think the church plays a huge role in mental health, and we can, well, in general, they play a huge role in health, sometimes stray away from conversations around mental health. Because there have been many church programs that are focused on getting care for diabetes, getting care for high blood pressure, and I think mental health should be a part of that conversation as well. So I think the church has a strong role to play, and instituting some of those programs would definitely allow them to do that.
So we got another question that came through we want to answer, and this one may be open for both. What would you advise or recommend for those that are for Black teens, getting them involved in terms of therapy, or what modes of recommendations would you get in terms of involving them in treatment and counseling?
That's a really good question. I think it might be useful to see if there's like support groups or like group therapy to like ease someone or especially teens into different therapy services. But I'll definitely pass this one over to Dr. Williams to see what he has to say.
Sure. Is it okay, Brian, or?
Yeah, go for it, man.
Oh,
We're all inclusive. This one is yours.
okay.
We got another one after you're done. So we got the next one all loaded up. We can take one more after your response, Dr. Williams.
Well, I think with teenagers, I think therapists and counselors need to be innovative, be creative in ways that they engage teenagers. I certainly agree with Dr. Dent that the use of groups have been useful and beneficial, but also using forms of therapy like your therapy, where you use the environment to engage your teenagers. I know as an adolescent myself, I received a lot of informal counseling on the basketball court. So taking you out to, and I guess that can be considered a form of play therapy, if you will. But being willing and innovative and using techniques like that, you can have a session on the basketball court or a session playing a video game. Just
So I
ways
got
to engage.
I'm sorry, Dr. Williams. Keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, we're good. We're good.
All right, so this is the last question we can take. What are the stigmas that you have personally worked through to kind of help you to get to a place of wellness?
Oh, that's a great question. I would probably say the I can do it on my own is the one that I've worked mostly through. I've always kind of been a self-starter. I've always been very independent, probably much to the chagrin of my parents. But I think that is the one that I've worked through the most, that it's okay to accept help and there's nothing wrong with accepting help. And once I kind of worked through that and went to therapy for myself, it was very helpful for me for where I was in my life.
All right, folks. So that's it for the Q&A, but I did want to make mention that for those that are looking for help, we're definitely going to have some resources available that can be sent out. There will be also a time to ask more questions at the end of this panel discussion. What we're going to do is now kind of like rapid fire. Like we have 4 questions. It's going to go back and forth between Dr. Dent and Dr. Williams. It's going to be time sensitive. All right, Dr. Dent, Dr. Williams, you ready for your first one? You got 10 minutes on the clock here. All right, so here's the first one. How does stigma impact inequities and health outcomes in Black communities compared to other races and white communities? We are now on the clock.
Dr. Dent, do you want to? You did a wonderful presentation. I'll follow up from you on this one.
Okay. Well, I'll start by saying that stigma exists in every community. It's just to varying degrees and different kinds. I would say that for us, stigma can be extremely strong because of the histories that I mentioned. And because of our experience in the medical and mental health care systems, we have a particularly unique experience of stigma. It's deeply entrenched, and it's going to take a lot of work from us and from the mental health system to shift the narrative. But as we all know, the work is important and necessary. I'll also say that stigma in white communities is not typically based on race. It's just the general stigma against people experiencing mental illness. So we as Black people experience this general stigma that everyone does, in addition to the stigma that's based on our history within the mental health care system. So there's a lot for us to overcome. But I think that having some of these conversations like we're doing right now is definitely going to help us combat stigma.
And I would say to follow up what Dr. Dent has already stated in her presentation, in terms of the history of stigma, I think we have to be careful not to pathologize stigma necessarily. And as a mental health care professional or system, we have to own up to much of the responsibility. For another words, like if we pathologize it, what happens is we own the power to define and label. Okay. For an example, if someone came into your house and then turned off the lights, and then you had a hard time finding your way around the house, and then they labeled your difficulty finding a way around the house as you being blind, then the healthcare system becomes or has the power to actually create the conditions for your so-called pathology and to define and label it. So I believe that with the healthcare profession, I think we have to earn our clients' trust. I believe that at this point, and I even if I'm looking for a therapist myself, we must approach that endeavor with caution, because I don't believe that the profession is fully competent in working with people in the Black community. As a matter of fact, I would actually go as far to say that there are more incompetent therapists working with Black people than competent people working with Black people. So while I do feel as though Black people should seek help, the outcome is not always a positive outcome. And I can give you 2 examples really quick, because I know we only have 10 minutes with this. I have 2 members in my family, 2 very close members, who both served in the Vietnam War. So they're both vets. And as recent as this past weekend, I spoke to one, and he informed me that he took my advice in seeking help for his PTSD symptoms. So he was basically thanking me for his advice. I mean, for giving him this advice. And this is something that he has been holding off for decades. And so he finally, went and he was saying, thank you. It's been a wonder, like even in the first few groups. But the other family member, again, a vet, and he went to seek help for his symptoms and so forth. And the psychiatrist put him on so much medication that he wasn't himself anymore. As a matter of fact, he started to have suicidal ideations, thoughts, gestures, and so forth. He avoided or withdrew from his family, stopped playing golf. And so as you can see, the outcome was totally different. So I say all this to say, although, yes, our people, our family, friends, we need to seek help when needed, but also as a mental health profession, we have to own up to much of the responsibility in removing this stigma. Because I would not send anyone, we shouldn't ethically send people into harm's way. So psychology or counseling is like a double-edged sword. We can do more harm than help in most cases.
There's time for leftovers, but if not, we can go to the second panel question. How would you like to proceed, Dr. Williams and Dr. Dent?
We can take questions if you like.
All right. Well, why don't we do it this way, if you're fine? Well, if we got questions, we could get a quick one in before we get to the question number 2. So just give me a moment as we're looking through chat.
If I could also add, while we're looking for the chat, the question is that the state of mental health in the Black community is also a reflection of the state of mental health in the United States. So within the United States, again, for people in the Black community, they're in a situation where people outside of their community, when I say outside of the community, Black people do not have the power to define mental health in this country. So unfortunately, people outside of the Black community have the power to define what is normal and abnormal for the Black psyche. Then in that situation, in that unique situation, we really reflect the state of mental health overall in the United States.
So we're going to stay with that same wavelength, okay, Dr. Williams, because the next question is related to what models of therapy in terms of working with Black clients would you advise and recommend? So in terms of the Black experience, what would you recommend in terms of treatment modality is the question. So keep on that same wavelength. If you want to take the floor, Dr. Dent, if you want to jump in, that's fine too. We got a couple minutes.
Oh, that's okay. I'm going to defer to Dr. Williams, the clinician, on this one.
Okay, so I don't subscribe to any Western theories or ideologies in terms of counseling modalities. I consider myself to be a Pan-Africanist. I believe in African-centered counseling or psychotherapy modalities. Um, that does not necessarily carry the same Western theories. Well, in terms of African-centered counseling, we don't have a list of therapies like Westerners do. But if I had to choose one, I'm not sure if people are familiar with into psychotherapy. And then someone asked the question earlier, what is the relationship with the church and mental health? So if you look at mental health around the world, globally, in terms of how Black people define mental health, most Black people consider themselves to be spirit first. So throughout the world, they were looking to find a therapist, realize that the term therapist or counselor is not a term that people use across the world. So in which case they may be seeking someone of a spiritual or religious authority. So in Nigeria, they may seek a Babalawo, which is a spiritual priestess. So yes, theology and psychology are like sister disciplines, if you will. And as a matter of fact, psychology, the term psychology, the root word of psychology, psyche, derived from the Greek goddess Psyche. And that term was then borrowed from the Egyptians or the ancient Kemetics. That term psyche was borrowed from the term Seku. Seku means the illumination of the soul. So in actuality, we've come full circle where in ancient times, psychology was the study of the soul. And over these centuries, Westerners or Europeans have come to define the study of the soul as the study of the mind, or the study of human behavior, and the study of what we have today in terms of psychology. So in terms of modality, I'm sorry, real quick, I'll end right here. In terms of modality, I would say that the modality must be grounded in spirit or spiritness.
And we appreciate, Dr. Williams, that level of depth, because for a lot of folks, they may not have that level of information. And, you're speaking to a wide audience. There's folks, I'm pretty sure, that are like trained therapists. We have folks in the community that's hearing from everybody right now. So kind of giving that level of history is very relevant. And let me kind of springboard to second question, question number 2 here. What is the historical and very current impact of racism on the mental health of the Black community overall? So I know we got 5 minutes, so I know it's tough to kind of get all that jammed in by like 6:50, but that's kind of what we're looking at with time. And of course, there's always an opportunity for folks to utilize chat. We can always do a part 2 to the question if necessary.
I mean, I guess I'll go ahead and start on this one. I would just say that the impact of racism on our mental health is huge. And it's a collective experience that we all as Black people feel together. And every social system that has been designed in our country has been rigged against us, from gerrymandering in politics to redlining in housing to outright medical racism in the healthcare system. So it's not just overt interpersonal racism, it's structural racism that is affecting our mental health when we can't get jobs and we can't, the things that we want to take care of our family, it's also that. And I think a lot of times we don't really think about that, and we don't know how to quantify those things, so we just kind of defer to the interpersonal racism rather than these huge structures that are also affecting us. And that's why I think it's so important that we continue to identify ways to protect our peace and care for ourselves in our communities, because it's a lot, honestly.
Yeah, I concur. I think a lot of times when we think about or talk about racism, we think about those acute interpersonal interactions, and we forget that racism is a system. And so I'm sure many of your audience are familiar with terms such as microaggressions, micro insults, micro assaults, micro attacks, and so forth. So it's just those everyday subtle slights that weighs on African people. And to experience this day in and day out in terms of your mental health is tiring, fatigue, it's stressful. And then on a larger scale, it's traumatic. And a lot of people don't know or don't realize what trauma may look like. And I know we'll talk about police brutality a little bit later, but just the trauma could look like your disconnect. So in other words, I found myself being traumatized by viewing so many videos where I got to a point where I was viewing the video and I was just numb. I was emotionless. And I started to look at the view the videos more cerebral, trying to view the videos from an intellectual perspective. So I found myself disconnecting. And so that could be a symptom. I'm sure many of you may have seen a video that was circulating on social media where the young boy, he looked like he was no more than 8 or 9 playing basketball in his driveway. And a police car was driving down the street. He saw the police car and he literally hid behind his car, his parents' car, and hid behind the car in order to wait the police out, basically. That's a form of trauma. So we need to realize that trauma comes in many forms. I know we only have 5 minutes, but I mean, anybody can just Google, trauma symptoms or go to the DSM and look up trauma.
Dr. Williams, you could just keep on talking. Guess what number question 3 looks like? Let's go ahead and move that slide because it's all connected to what you just shared, my friend. Discuss the recent incidents of police brutality and violence. So whoever wants to take it, we have time. Let's keep the dialogue going.
Well, I can go ahead and start on this question. As a follow-up to what Dr. Williams was just saying, it's been a very challenging time. And as Dr. Williams just said, it's really traumatic for us to take in all of that imagery and those videos on a constant basis. And for myself, as a public health professional, I've been really struggling because it's really been heartbreaking for me to watch Black people during the coronavirus pandemic, which we know is more likely to kill Black people, having to risk their lives and their health in order to combat racism and police brutality and the violence that's happening. And I guess for me, it's just really indicative of our country that even in a global health pandemic, we still have to fight the pandemic and the racism, and we're dying more because of the racism and the pandemic. So I mean, that's kind of where I've been with that, is that it's a lot. And so I've been trying to take in my news piecemeal to figure out how I work through that for myself.
I think in terms of police brutality and violence in particular, and this may be difficult for people to swallow, is that the police represents an extension of white supremacy. And what do we mean by that is that we all know that the history of policing within the Black community has been one of KKK involvement and overseeing, not protecting the Black community, but overseeing the Black community. And so when we look at violence as it relates to police officers, there's 2 types of violence. There's legitimized or legitimate violence, and there's illegitimized or illegitimate violence, meaning when the violence is top down, when it's the state imposing violence on its civilians, that form of violence is legal. When the when the violent dynamics or aggression is then lateral, when it's people against people, that's the illegal violence. So I say that to say that the only people in the state or in who can legally use violence are those people who work for the state or work for the government, so to speak. In other words, if the U.S. was at war with another country, that's legal violence. So yeah, we train people to use violence, but in the same respect, if someone imposed violence against the state, that would be considered treason. So what we're seeing in the streets in terms of police brutality and so forth, we're seeing exactly what the police department or the police force was designed to do.
All right,
And I'm
folks. Well, you're okay. We're actually doing well. So let me kind of check in terms of time and when I'm saying things. If we want to keep going for a few minutes, it's perfectly fine. We only have one more question left on the technical panel discussion. It's a lot of meat to it, though, Dr. Williams and Dr. Dent. So it could take some depth to get into it. But then probably around 7:10 or so, we'll look at doing some leftovers with Q&A that wasn't addressed earlier. So if you want to go into more depth in terms of question 3, that's fine. If you want to move forward because you got out what you needed, we'll go to the last remaining question in the panel discussion. Doctor's choice of where we go.
I'll just add one more quick thing in terms of police violence. Many people in viewing videos, they may ask questions like, why didn't the person just comply? Or why didn't the person do this? Or why didn't the police, why didn't the civilian do that? Again, going back to trauma, the intergenerational trauma experienced by Black people at the hands of police, again, the response by Black people in many cases is a traumatic response, right? In other words, I may be so traumatized, which a lot of cases I am. I mean, and I just gave you a story with the little boy who probably have never had any direct interaction with police. But Black people are indirectly traumatized. And again, this is through generations, right? So when the police pull me over, so many thoughts go through my mind. And so I may not be as willing to just do everything the police may tell me to do because I'm already in defensive mode because I'm fearing at that time. And so police are not, and I can't even say that police are not trained. I'm kind of thinking that, again, if I accept the position that they don't care, and I'm not saying all police by any means, I'm not saying all police, but some just don't care about your mental health state at that particular time. They know that they have a job to do and they need you to do what they're asking you to do. And that's to follow A, B, and C.
So I'm hearing you say, Dr. Williams, there's some instances where you're looking at law enforcement, looking at their job maybe through a different lens of protecting and serving versus what we may be looking for with protecting and serving. And sometimes those priorities don't always intersect and cross each other. Is that the way I'm getting you?
Absolutely. So in other words, we're expecting police to have a therapeutic response, interaction with us, right? And I'm saying that police are not trained. Well, I'm not sure if they are or not. But the idea is that they're not trained to have that therapeutic interaction with a community that has been traumatized. And so when people talk about defunding the police, what they're talking about is perhaps putting other mental health professionals on the scene, or having police go under, mental health training, because we're seeing a lot of people who are being, I don't want to say a lot of, I want to over exaggerate, but people are being killed by the police who have mental health issues, and they're not following the police commands A, B, and C. And one case in particular I'm talking about is with Elijah McCain. And I'm not saying that I have no right to diagnose him, but when he is saying that he's different, when he's saying that he's an introvert, I think he's communicating to the police that you need to take that into consideration.
Those are all fair points, and I'm hearing a lot of it is based on engagement and how we engage folks when we first had that response. Dr. Dent, anything you have before we transition to the last panel discussion question?
Yeah, just following up on what Dr. Williams just said with calls to defund the police, what I would say for us, I would recommend reading about abolition and reading about defunding the police and what that looks like, because I, for one, I am not familiar with the abolition movement, but have been reading a lot more and reading Angela Davis and, you know, the women who have been at the front of these movements, so that we can better understand because a lot of people they're like, well, what are we going to do without the police? But as Dr. Williams said, the police are state-sanctioned violence. So if we are able to defund and divert money to mental health services and other community services, then we can better serve communities.
Well, we got time to get through the fourth one, but like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of meat to it. Can we get the slide to change over to question 4? So like I said, there's a lot. What can we do individually and collectively to bring about meaningful and long overdue change to improve outcomes and lives of our Black community? Let me give a second to kind of paraphrase this, because like I said, there's a lot there and it does kind of read a little broad. So one way to kind of help the audience is, and what I'm asking to the two panelists now is, you know, let's consider how outcomes can change with relationships with family, friends, co-workers. How can folks in the Black community look at making a difference in regards to employment, education, and of course, spirituality in terms of from that base and that premise. So it's a lot of meat to it, but we can kind of peel back the onion to get to these layers. I think the audience would be very, they will benefit from that level of Q&A when it comes to this question in particular.
Ladies first.
Okay, Dr. Williams. So I've been thinking a lot about this question since Brian sent us it. And one thing I would like to say is, for generations, we have been bringing about change in our community. So I would like to start there. We have built food pantries to help families in need. We've built rec centers. We've opened community health clinics, and we have continued to take care of us. I think now what we can do is really find out what our role is in the current movement. So we each have talents and skills that are useful to our communities. And so some of us might be protesting, some of us might decide to run for office, some of us might be donating money or time or food or supplies or what have you.
Like 10 minutes.
And some of us might be taking on the emotional labor of engaging in difficult or frustrating conversations with non-Black people about addressing structural racism in both our personal and work lives. For me, something I've been thinking about is, like, what could my role be and how can I better support my community? And one thing that I think I could do is helping, like, Black small nonprofits with grant writing, because I've been in school for 87 years, and being able to help them get more money to bring back into our communities would allow them to do great work that they've already been doing on a larger scale. So I think it's about each of us thinking about the talents and skills that we have to bring back to our communities. Yeah, so that's what I've been thinking about for that question.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that I think the Black community, I think in order to get started with anything as a collective, there must be first an agreement that we are a collective. Meaning, in my multicultural class at Bowie State, on the first night, I'll ask all the students to go around and to give me their ethnic identity. And I would say in a class of 20, let's say 15 are students of African descent, you would be amazed in terms of the different identities I will get from students of African descent. And I highlight that on the first night because these are master's students. These are students in a master's program. And so I asked them, at this level of education, like you are considered to be learned individuals. So imagine in terms of the general population, how confused people of African descent are in terms of their identity. How can we do anything collectively if we don't even agree on who we are? And I'm not saying that everybody needs to say that they are this or they are that, but the range of responses that I receive would blow most people's mind. So I think first we need to start there. I think that your identity then guides your behavior in other spaces and in terms of your lifestyle and so forth. So I tell my students to identify myself as a American African. And they would say, well, what is an American African? You're not African American, so forth. Well, in the English language, we have the adjective, then we have the noun. So I'm African first. And if you ask me what type of African am I, I'm an African that resides in the United States. I see myself as a Pan-Africanist. So I have that connection with other Africans throughout the diaspora. And why is that important? Is when you tell Black people, well, this person in Africa or Jamaica or Haiti or wherever are your brothers and sisters, the first thing oftentimes I hear is that African people don't even like us. I'm American. African people don't even like us. And then my response is, oh, okay, so America likes you. And so then they get to see that contradiction in terms of there's something else that explains why we do not want to identify ourselves as such. And then when we then begin to identify ourselves, and then we can work on other things. Like, what do you have in your household? Do you have African affirming images and symbols in your household? Are you studying and reading about African people? Are you celebrating African people? Do you have African rituals? Do you have African activities? So I'll stop there because we can go on and on with that. Yeah.
All righty. So you had extra time, Dr. Williams. I'm pretty sure everybody was. Yeah, you got like.
Okay. I thought I was
before we go into Q&A. I mean, I don't want to get your attention, Dr. Williams. I would have stopped you.
Okay. I mean, it's good to see, like most recently, so many people celebrating Juneteenth. And so in my classes, I talk a lot about holidays, which are considered holy days. And again, this answer is still on response in terms of what we can do in terms of healthy outcomes. So I ask students, what holidays do Black people celebrate? What holidays do we have that affirm who we are? And so before this 2020 Juneteenth, most Black people probably had never heard of Juneteenth. But Juneteenth is just one liberation day. Other states outside of Texas have other dates of liberation that they celebrate. Even Kwanzaa. And Kwanzaa is not meant to be a replacement for Christmas. There's no necessary contradiction necessarily in celebrating both. We celebrate the birth or Malcolm X's birthday, Martin Luther King's birthday. So lifestyle is what we can do. In other words, I believe more so in prevention than intervention. I don't want to say it annoys me, but it annoys me when we become a reactionary people, meaning this happens and then we react to that. In other words, the NFL is happening, so we reacting to the NFL. Police brutality happens, so we react to police brutality, because tomorrow's going to be something different. And I'm saying that we should engage in self-care activities that affirm who we are, on a daily basis as a lifestyle. That way, when crises happen, there's nothing that we need to change. We're already practicing our culture, which is a blueprint for living anyway. And it's a protective mechanism anyway, in terms of how we deal with, let's say, this pandemic. People say, well, what should you do during the pandemic? Much of what you should do should be what you've already been doing. So we should already been exercising. I don't exercise as much as I should, but we should already be out enjoying the environment, connecting with our loved ones in different ways, other types of relief, such as yoga or meditation or healthy eating. There's some other things. Spending time with family and loved ones. So it shouldn't be this happened, so then I must do this.
Well, thanks for the depth, Dr. Williams. I think that giving those concrete examples kind of helps the audience when we ask a loaded question that can go in so many different directions. At this point, we've gotten through all 4 questions for the panel discussion, but we do, as I mentioned, have some leftovers that we never got to in the chat. So I wanted to put up the first one. And this is, again, it's for Dr. Williams and Dr. Dent. It says, as a Black law enforcement officer, how do we deal with supporting the movement, but also know we are part of the system as well? So that's the first question that came in the Q&A section.
Wow. I've had friends who are also in Black law enforcement. I would say the first thing, probably the most difficult thing, is to hold your colleagues accountable. And I know in some states they're putting laws in place that would require and demand that officers hold their colleagues accountable. Because I think that's part of what sustains what's going on. It's kind of also like, white supremacy. Racism can only sustain if people who consider themselves to be non-racist to speak out. So if you consider yourself to be non-racist and racism is happening, you have to speak out against it. I feel the same way with police brutality. So I think speaking out against your colleagues is one thing. And I think showing empathy to not just the Black community, but communities of color, showing empathy and not approaching the situation from a defensive position, a defensive posture. So empathy is what I would say.
Dr. Dent, you want to take a stab at that one too?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough question, and I concur with what Dr. Williams has said so far. And I would also add being present in your community and making sure that people know that they can come to you, and that exactly what Dr. Williams said, that you are empathetic, you are going to listen, and you're doing what you can from within to support your community and hold your colleagues accountable.
Y'all ready to keep going? Because I got a few more here. All right, here's the next one. As someone involved in the community, how do we mentally continue to fight, although it may appear that progress is slow or not happening at all?
We may never see the changes or the progress that we would like to see in our lifetime. And so we must be diligent and faithful to the struggle without necessarily seeing concrete changes. In other words, our ancestors fought, and some of them fought and they have never seen a day of freedom. And so we must continue in that same vein in terms of we must fight knowing that we may never ever live to see the changes that we fought for. And that takes a lot of faith. And so if you look at the centuries of enslavement and Jim Crow thereafter, if you add all those years up, it's probably going to take the same amount of years to see the changes, the meaningful changes that we want to see on the other end. In other words, if African people were captive or oppressed for 300, 400 years, we may not see the changes that the end game until or for another 300, 400 years. I know that doesn't sound very encouraging or hopeful, but yeah, we have seen some changes, but the power dynamic still exists in terms of white versus non-white.
And I would also add that you can fight and also take care of yourself. You can continue a good fight. And as Dr. Williams said, making self-care a lifestyle and taking care of your physical, your mental, your social, your spiritual well-being is gonna enable you to keep fighting. So you might have to take a break, and that's okay, because that break allows you to regain the energy to keep fighting, so that the people that come far after us will hopefully be reaping the benefits of our hard work.
All right, well, we still got a couple more questions, y'all. We can go all the way to the 25, so we still have time, audience. The next question, do you think Black people with a disability are less likely to be believed that they are in need of any kind of accommodations or a job?
Wow. So I do, and with any type of disability, I know that disabilities come in many forms, whether it's a physical or cognitive or emotional or behavior disabilities. Sometimes I feel as though disabilities in the Black community can be overlooked as something that's normal. In other words, if there's, the disability, whether it's behavior, emotional, or whatever, can be attributed to their race, and not receive the same sensitivity and awareness as those with disability in the white community. For an example, I have a friend, and I hope I'm not disclosing too much, who in high school, in the area of sports and scholarships and so forth, he was telling me that in the private school where he works, they encourage their white students to concur with these disabilities so that they can get accommodations. And these accommodations in the white community are just that, they're accommodations which give them an advantage for scholarships and testing and so forth and so on. Black people are not afforded that same benefit of the doubt with a disability. If Black people have a disability, then it's in many cases attributed to this is what Black people look like, or is due to their race. And we also know that, criminal behavior a lot of times in the white community takes consideration of mental health or disability and so forth and so on. Criminal behavior in the Black community is typically attributed to Black morality, thuggish behavior and so forth, absent of any type of mental health consideration. So yes, I do feel as though disability plays a huge factor in the Black community.
And I'm almost hearing you say in a way where it's attached to stigma too, as you talk about disability, even though we heard Dr. Dent mention that as well earlier.
Absolutely.
So the questions just keep rolling in, y'all. So let's just keep doing it. They just keep coming. So I got more for you. Dr. Williams, you mentioned the term about spirituality first. Can you repeat, please, and can you reiterate?
Absolutely. So I see spirituality in terms of spirituality and mental health. Typically in the literature, or when we talk about spirituality in counseling, we talk about it as a consideration. In other words, it's something that's mentioned at the end of the article or at the end of the chapter, or something that we should consider. And so my position in the Black community is that spirituality is not the cream in your coffee, meaning some days you add cream to your coffee and some days you don't. So it's not something that is on and it's off. So for me and in the Black community, spirituality are the coffee beans itself. It's the essence or it's the core of your helping modality or approach with people in the African community. As I stated before, if you go to many parts of Africa or just African people throughout the diaspora, you may not even have a term for a counselor. You may not even have a term for psychologists or therapists. The people who you seek are people who have a spiritual or religious background. And that has traditionally been the case for Africans in America as well. And so yes, and I don't mean to confuse or use religion interchangeably with spirituality, but typically throughout the world, African people have traditionally seen themselves as spirit first, and so the approach has taken spirituality into consideration. Not just consideration, it has formed the basis of the connection between the client and the therapist. It has formed the basis of what does mental health look like. It has formed the basis of assessment and diagnosis and treatment and prognosis. You're muted, Brian.
Got it. Hey, the moderator has a couple missteps occasionally here, but I took myself off real quickly and I pivoted. So we got 2 more questions. I think we can manage 3, possibly by 7:25. That's the goal. So one question that came from the audience is, what do the panelists think about terms such as non-racist versus anti-racist? And the second part of the question is, how do you distinguish between the two, if at all?
That's a really good question. I would say that anti-racist and non-racist are different. I would say that I might even put non-racist people in the category of being racist, because I kind of believe in the dichotomy. Like, you're either working against the system and trying to dismantle the systems of oppression, or you're for the system and benefiting from it in some way. So that's pretty much where I land on that.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Dent. Non-racist seem it for me, it assumes a posture of being neutral. And in a situation when it comes to racism, I don't think that there's room or space for being neutral. I think the term anti-racism implies action. It implies combating racism. Why non-racist somewhat implies a position of complicity, to put it kindly.
That was very political, Dr. Williams, but it's fine. It's fine.
You like that?
I do, and I also appreciate the transparency and panelists being candid. So this is an open forum that we're working through. We appreciate all the questions that are being answered. I have another one, and this looks like it's coming from a clinician, or just thoughts about what a clinician could do. It says, what are some actions a clinician can take to be actively anti-racist in their line of work? So this seems to be like, think about a clinician who's out in the field working with individuals that may have some form of, mental health diagnosis. How can they get involved?
When I think of anti-racism, I don't believe that people of color can be racist to start with. So I would, because we're talking about power. So people of color, non-white people do not have the power to be racist. So I want to talk specifically to the Caucasian or therapists, counselors of European descent. I think it takes effort to be a non-racist, because if you are educated in the United States educational system, you've been socialized and trained and educated to think like a racist or to be a racist. So it would take a purposeful and deliberate effort to be a non-racist and to help out in the struggle, which is an everyday thing, and it requires courage. It requires the willingness to accept criticism and flack from your colleagues. And to be honest, at the same time, what you're doing is you are giving back your privilege card. And I think that you can't be competent in doing the work that you have and you continue to carry your white privilege card.
And I would also add that clinicians should be examining their own workplace. So how many Black counselors or mental health professionals, how many Black people are in leadership in your clinic or your mental health care system. And I would also encourage people to think about the ways that they're interacting with their Black clients from a place of non-defensiveness. And think about the times with Black clients that you may have dismissed when they said they were experiencing racism and said, well, maybe is it this? And reflect on those moments and get the additional training you need to figure out how to better approach those moments with other clients.
Can I throw one last question out there to finish tonight before we conclude? Because it's 7:23, and I wanted to give the audience every opportunity to ask this well-esteemed panel questions. So here's the last one of the night, then I'll give a few takeaways and we'll finish on time at 7:30. What are your thoughts on the differences in mental illness between Black men and Black women? Ooh. Sorry, I only gave you 3 minutes, Dr. Williams. I apologize. I'll give you 4.
You can go right ahead, Dr. Dent.
Ladies first.
Thanks, Dr. Williams.
Ladies first.
I think that's a really good question. And I think in terms of, mental illness differences between Black men and Black women, I would say that there's an approach that's different, but there's a lot that's the same. So like, for example, these perceptions of strength, both men and women Black women have them. They manifest a little differently. One manifests as like basically toxic masculinity, and the other manifests as the need to always be taking care of other people and to be strong, because yes, the need to continue to take care of people and to be strong, but they're both perceptions of strength that may keep people from getting the health care that they need. But I think I'm just still trying to think about this question because it's a really good one, that there are more similarities than there are differences. I would just keep going back to that, and that the manifestations are different. And the toxic masculinity piece is so drilled down for men that I think that is a very hard for them to overcome. And I will also say that for like men and women, our relationships can be different sometimes. So women may have a lot of emotional support and they may talk to their friends about a lot of issues that they are facing, but men might not have the same relationship with their friends. And so in that way, women can be getting more support from their groups than men are getting from theirs, and it may affect them differently. I will say that like there is some evidence that women internalize and men externalize, meaning that women will take all of these things that are happening and that will manifest within their bodies, while men may act out, they may fight, so there are some differences in how Black men and women? It's a great question, and I'm gonna think a little bit more about it. And go ahead, Dr. Williams.
Okay.
Now
So-
I'm gonna put 60 seconds on the table, Dr. Williams, because we're getting close to
60
it.
seconds. So real quick, like there's a whole history behind the differences, the gender differences in the mental health field. This field has been dominated by males, in particular white males, and women representing a marginalized gender. In the same way Black people have been treated, women have been mistreated, misdiagnosed, and abused by the profession as well. With hysteria, they used to diagnose hysteria in women as their uterus wandering throughout their body. And so treatment required the massaging of a female's vagina. We can talk about how women were discredited in the early 20s, 30s, like just in the early part of the decade, where if they were not obedient or agreeable to their husbands, then they were put in mental health asylums. And he was able to find a new wife. So yes, mental health, the field has been used to control women, to marginalize women, oppress them. And as Dr. Den has said, there's differences in the way men and women may display symptoms. Men tending to be more aggressive and violent in their mental health status versus women. But yeah, with 60 seconds, Brian, I'll just go ahead and stop there.
And you know what? This is a perfect segue, though. So first, another silent round of applause for Dr. Randall Dent, Dr. Otis Williams III, because they answered a lot of questions in a short amount of time. So silent clap for those folks, right, for the good work that's being done. But also, this is a natural segue for the audience, because we're going to email folks, but we would like to do this event again. But we need the help and support of the audience responding back to once we email out the survey. So if folks like what they heard and want to have more depth to the conversation, we can definitely spend more time in the future, but we need to hear from y'all. Also, I really want to talk about two important phone numbers specifically for Fairfax County residents. One is if you want to get mental health services, you can always call entry and referral at 703-383-8500. Typically, it's 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. That would be excluding holidays. The government is observing a holiday, as we know, this upcoming Friday. But typically, it's Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And also for Fairfax County residents, please call, if you need to, if you're in true crisis, please call emergency services at 703-573-5679. That's a 24/7, 365 days of the year opportunity if you're in true crisis and you know that a mental health intervention is needed because you may be at risk or you're aware or worried that somebody else may be at risk. Please utilize that phone number. We're out of time, but some fast takeaways here. The handout section does have resources. Use them. All right, there was 3 takeaways. I found like 10 takeaways to take, but I'm just running out of time. What I've written down was keep fight and please take care of yourself. For those in the Black community, you can still fight and take care of yourself dually at the same time. The second one, we learned history in terms of stigma and how the Black community has frequently been misdiagnosed, even with schizophrenia and other severe mental illnesses. Also, we learned about trauma and what it looks like. And sometimes those in the Black community feel desensitized once they keep seeing videos over and over and over being shown at a high clip. So those were just some of the takeaways. Again, one last silent round of applause, silent class for Dr. Randall Dent, Dr. Otis Williams. Take care, audience. Have a great night, and we look forward to your email responses once we send out a survey. Take care, everybody. Hallelujah.